Hi everybody, this is Warren Herman. Today I'd like us to think about something that can help us to understand the way to integrate various different practices into the life of Catholic spirituality. We can think of this subject using some very broad categories that reflect some trends in the modern church. We can think of traditional forms of Catholic spirituality as resembling the traditional Latin Mass, as having what in Latin is called an ad orientem posture, meaning that they are centered entirely on God and have an orientation toward God that gives them a kind of lightness, in a sense, that gives them a sense in which all the natural faculties, all the natural elements are ordered toward the worship of God. So, for example, if I think a thought in my mind, a thought might have a certain natural effect on me. If I pray, then that is a thought in my mind. But it also has a relational aspect, an ability to be in touch with grace. Grace builds on nature, and there is a sense in which, in the traditional forms of Catholic spirituality, there is this way in which the natural structure of the approach, which we could think of almost like a sail catching wind, the natural structures of the various forms of spiritual life, spiritual practice, mysticism, so on and so forth, liturgy, they all have this way in which they orient themselves toward God in a way that we might describe. It's hard to put these things into words that make sense of exactly what I'm trying to describe. But there's a sense in which it's not minimalist, but it is that there is nothing superfluous. It points directly at God. So, for example, in the Latin Mass, we see very clearly that God is being worshipped. We see very clearly everything is oriented toward this offering of sacrifice. We see that there is this certain way in which it points toward God. Now, this is nothing new for people who've looked at this subject, but we can see that principle. We could call that the ad orientem principle, meaning which the Latin words mean facing the east, but in popular understanding it means facing, when the priest faces the altar, or we can use this as an attitude of facing directly at God. Where are we going with this? Well, the ultimate problem that we have this sense in which there are many ways in which ideologies and approaches to spirituality are beginning to filter into the church, which have, their origins in other approaches. So, for example, there might be something that might be related to the spirituality of certain Protestant groups, or even something that might be, there might be somebody looking at how can we integrate something from an Eastern religion. And we want to understand, how can we do this? How can we reorient some of these things, adopt some of these things, convert or so-called, baptize these things? Can we do that? And the answer broadly is that by and large this can be done, but it has to be done very skillfully and very carefully and very, it's something that we can do, and it's something that there's a very long history of doing, because even people like St. Thomas Aquinas, took the ideas of Aristotle and kind of broke them up, reoriented them, and made them part of the Christian tradition. And so this is something that can be done in various ways. There's ways in which we can take ideologies, spiritualities. There's ways in which we can kind of break them down, reorient them, and then they can become something that we can use. Now, the thing is that a lot of times when people see something in an Eastern faith, they might see, some kinds of, ideas that might, there might be ideas in the Western Christian mystical tradition that look like things that are in Eastern mysticism. They might get them confused. And the real problem is that a lot of the things that are in Eastern religions, for example, some of the meditation forms, we could broadly call them Luciferic. meaning that they point toward things that are a counterfeit, or things that seem to do the same thing as the Christian techniques but don't. By and large, what happens in the Eastern meditation techniques is that the entire spirituality is oriented toward what we might call the soul, the consciousness itself, the nature of mind. So there's a long-standing purification process that can be very technical in the Eastern religions, but it's oriented directly into the soul instead of oriented even more deeply toward God dwelling within the soul. So there's ways in which these techniques may superficially resemble the transformation that is possible through Christian mysticism and Christian spiritual practice, but they stop at a more superficial level, although it can seem as if they're dealing with very infinite realities, even experientially, because the soul, being made in the image of God, can be experienced as almost an infinite reality that seems to be one with everything. And that's kind of the effect of kind of going into the soul. Everything seems to be seen through the soul, and everything seems to be one, and that you end up with these type of mystical states that are very typical of Eastern meditation techniques. So, where are we going with all of this? What basically we need to understand is that there are ways of importing things into the Christian tradition, but we have to understand exactly what this looks like. So, for example, there are people who might say, in the history of Christian mysticism, there are people who might say that St. John of the Cross taught a method of contemplative prayer, when in actuality, St. John of the Cross really described states arrived at through maybe more normal methods of prayer, like reading scripture, reflecting on scripture. So there are ways in which people might take what a Christian mystic in the old ad orientem tradition might be using as a description and make it into an instruction. And this is something that happened, for example, in centering prayer, whereas things that are a description of a state, are made into more of a technique. And they might be understood as very high levels of prayer, when really they're a new method of prayer that might look like a very high form. Now, does it mean that we can't use approaches that lead to this kind of, it's not necessarily a count. So if I, for example, quiet down myself and repeat a phrase in prayer, it doesn't necessarily mean that I've arrived at a very advanced state of prayer. I'm only practicing a certain style of prayer. So what is the actual understanding of how we can know, what's the relationship between something like me repeating a phrase in prayer and me having gotten to the point in my prayer with scripture that I'm focused on one phrase and God is leading me into this phrase, and what's the relationship between those things? What's the relationship between the traditional practices and these new methods that may seem to cut some corners? Well, it's not necessarily that they're cutting corners. It's that almost in the sense that the new Mass is faced toward the people. But yet it's still a valid Mass, it's still a valid sacrifice. There's this way in which there are new supplemental forms that can be created that are not equivalent to their ancient forms. A prayer of transforming union, which is very advanced, is not the same thing as the piece I have repeating a phrase in prayer. But there's a way in which these versus populum, or facing the people forms of prayer, can be legitimate. There are ways in which they can be legitimately redeemed forms of things that are otherwise very dangerous. So, for example, if I simply repeat a phrase that is like Om, like a syllable from the Hindu tradition, to be one with the absolute, that will lead me to what we would call a Luciferic or a counterfeit state, because then I'm trapped in the soul thinking I'm in God. Whereas if I repeat the name Jesus, or cry out to God in some way, or even simply surrender to God, there are ways in which these things are not yet these old advanced prayer forms, but they're kind of something in the middle. They're not Luciferic, nor are they the ancient, what we might call the Christic. They are in the middle. They are something called the Christopheric. They bear Christ to us, but not in the same way as the traditional methods. They don't function as replacements. They function more as supplements. Maybe in a way they are somewhat more encumbered with naturalness, and they lead to consolations and experiences that are more natural than the ancient forms. There's more self in it, or there's more creation in it, versus the ratio of creation to grace is different in what we might call the Christopheric forms of supplemental prayer. The most important thing, though, is we don't want to have any sense of confusion between old advanced states of being, old processes, and some of these newer forms that are being developed. Now, is this an exact science? Probably not. But we need to have some kind of ways of situating these different disciplines. And so I think that this can be very useful to us, to kind of have this thing of these three levels, to understand that there is these things that are completely focused on self and on a counterfeit kind of natural mysticism, which are the things that are just kind of these undigested forms of outside ideologies and spiritualities outside the church. So something like, so let's say something like Zen, will be something undigested, leading to a completely mystical state that's outside, that's just like a natural counterfeit that's completely in the self. But if I then take that into some type of a mid-level context, it's not necessarily the same thing as when the great saint of the ancient times is just like has been praying their whole life and is in this one-pointed gaze at God, just being with God after having had all this other prayer leading up to it. If I just sit on my chair and just say, I'm just going to be with God, that's more of a style of prayer rather than the state of prayer reached by that advanced saint. It's something that is a method that's legitimate. It's Christopheric. It bears Christ. It helps me to bear Christ, but it has more naturalness in it than this other state. We shouldn't confuse this state, nor should these are newer forms. If I try to, these are newer ways of doing things as the church redeems the world in a different way and these ideologies of the world in a different way in modern times. And so we have this this way of understanding that these are Christopheric forms. They're not Luciferic forms, they're Christopheric, but they're not the ancient Christic forms. These are supplemental, not meant to supplant it. Do not supplant the old ways with these new Zen things or whatever. Don't supplant it, supplement it. And that's a legitimate thing. And we have to understand how exactly these things are. They're not this. They may resemble each other. The Christic things might resemble this thing. And in a way, these things might be able to, in a sense, prime the pump for these other states. There might be some overlap, and there might not be. But these things are legitimate in themselves. They can be useful, and they're usually focused. So for example, somebody might be led by God's grace into a special relationship of contemplation, whereas somebody, based on the sufferings of life, might be led to really practice a discipline of surrender. So the simple prayer of surrender for the person who's suffering from their anxious thoughts or something, dealing with a psychological need, might differ from an extensively contemplative vocation, where the person is being called to this deep union with God. It's different in some ways, and in some ways one might lead to the other. There might be some interplay here. I'm not going to say that there's no interplay at all, but we have to be careful with how we're making these distinctions, and I wanted to offer a potential understanding of how these things work so that we can kind of work with that and kind of understand how does this work, how do we redeem these things, how do we make these practices which are useful to people, and especially that's the bottom line, is that a lot of times people are in desperate need of being able to have an experience of serenity of some kind, and it's not wrong to use what we might call sanctified serotonin. So for example, it's not wrong to take a deep breath and get that natural consolation and yet think of God. But it is wrong if we just make the breath into an idol and focus on that and zone out into ourselves, into this natural consolation. That's bad. But it can be very bad if somebody thinks that they're getting in touch with God that way without really any relationship, and they're really just going into themselves, into this natural trance. So, we have to try to understand how can we integrate these things, how does this work? And so this is a paradigm for trying to understand that. The Luciferic, we don't want the Christopheric that is being built out of all the redeemed spiritual practices of other faiths, and the Christic, which is the traditional form of Catholic spirituality. So I hope that's a helpful paradigm.